Hi friends, my name is Maruti and I'm the co-founder of Cracku. In this video, we'll be analyzing the DashCAT 8. Let us first get started with the verbal section. In verbal section, as can be expected, there were 4 RCs. 3 RCs I think were easy to read, but the questions were difficult in all of them. There was one RC which I found to be slightly on the more difficult side to read, and the questions also were difficult. So if you are going through each of the RCs, there was one RC about police, especially I think this was set up in United States, the setup. It was not very difficult to read, but even in the passage itself, you could figure out that it was not very easy. It was not a very straightforward, just something which is objectively being told by the author. The author was also putting a lot of inferences in the passage itself. So even though it seemed easy to read on the first glance, when you dwell deeper into it, it is slightly on the trickier side, even just reading the passage and understanding it completely. Getting a sense of what the author was saying is easy, but the implications of all the subtle things that the author is mentioning, I felt was slightly on the difficult side, which was also reflected in the passage. I like this passage. I think this is a fairly good passage from a CAT standpoint. Questions were, I think there was some issue with answering them all very well, because like I said, the passage itself was slightly on the trickier side, but not very, very difficult. You won't lose track of it. You won't lose concentration or something like that, but understanding all the subtleties in that passage is not very straightforward. This is as far as the first passage is concerned. The second passage was about technology. This was about the techno movement, techno optimist movement. This again was there, but again, it feels like an easy passage, at least the context of it, because most of us are in technology. We use technology quite a lot. And I also had an understanding of what the passage was being referred to, what is the essay that was being referred to in the passage. But again, towards after the first 2-3 paragraphs, again, it becomes slightly more trickier to really read. This also I felt was not a very easy passage. The questions also I think were not very straightforward. There were also some inference-based questions. So overall, even I felt, even for this passage, I felt was definitely on the easy to medium side. Easy because you know what the passage is being talked about. You know what is the event or the issue that is being talked about. For most of the passage, also you can read it without losing concentration because it is an interesting topic. But still, the subtleties, I think, are definitely an issue where for you to understand exactly the implications of everything the author is saying or the author is inferring to, it will take you maybe reading one more time. The third one I felt was a slightly difficult passage to read. I think this is the fourth one. The third one was about dark matter. Very interesting topic. This was the passage I attempted at the end where I had to read it 2 times to really understand it. But once I understood it, I felt this was an interesting passage. There were 1 or 2 questions which I felt were definitely on the easier side, especially the last question in this passage I felt was definitely an easy one, which people should definitely get it correct. So there were 1 or 2 questions in this, even though I felt this passage amongst the remaining 4 was slightly on the difficult side to read because this seemed like slightly more technical, more scientific. So it was not something which is like say about any particular current affairs event. This was about some scientific concept. So for me to understand it, I had to read it 2 times. So from that standpoint, I felt this was a difficult passage to read, but there were 1 or 2 questions which are definitely on the easier side. And there were not a lot of inference-based questions. I think there was 1 inference-based question in this, which I got wrong, but the remaining 3 I felt were not difficult. The questions I think were definitely possible to solve. The fourth one was the passage that I attempted first because I felt this would be an interesting passage. And I found it to be very, very interesting, but I got most of the questions wrong in this passage. So there might be multiple reasons for it. This was the first passage I attempted. So sometimes when I first start attempting a section, it is possible that I'm not completely tuned in. I'm not 100% focused. Probably that is one of the reasons. But another reason I felt was that there were a lot of inference-based questions. Out of the 4 questions in this passage, I think there were 3 questions which were inference-based. And when you have inference-based questions, especially at the start, it requires a lot more concentration, which I think I was not able to provide. So overall, I felt this was definitely a tricky passage. The passage was easy, but the questions were definitely pretty difficult in the 4th one. This was about some inhabited island where they were like an ancient civilization, something like that. That I felt the passage was easy, but the questions were definitely on the difficult side because a lot of inference-based questions were involved in it. So overall, if I have to just rate the reading comprehensions, I would say that there is no comprehension, no RC which was definitely very easy or something where you could easily score. Sometimes in many of the sections, you get 1 or 2 RCs where I would recommend that, okay, this is an RC where you have to score. Here, unfortunately, I felt all the RCs, if the passage was easy, the questions were difficult. sometimes the passage itself was tricky, where you could get the sense of the passage, but even when you're reading, you could figure out that the author is putting more inferences. Essentially, the author is talking from both sides. He's saying that, okay, this, for example, if you're looking at the police one, he's saying that, okay, increased police is good, but also it has some problems. And if you're decreasing police, also there will be some issues. So when a author is talking from both sides, he is treading a very cautious line. So for you to exactly understand what the author is saying, or which of the following arguments will the author completely agree with, the accuracy will go down because the author is talking from both sides. That I think was the issue with many of the RCs in this particular section. So overall, I felt RCs were not very easy. Coming to the verbal section, para summaries I felt were definitely on the difficult side. Again, I think they were on the difficult side also because the difficulty of the RCs would reflect over here. When you're spending a lot of time doing the RCs, or when you're answering the RCs and you know that it is not going very well, maybe when I start attempting para summaries, also I'm slightly underconfident, where I feel that the section is not going too well. So that might be one of the reasons, but both the para summaries, I got them wrong and I couldn't even make a lot of headway. Sometimes when I attempt para summaries, I feel that, okay, out of the 4 options, 2 options are definitely wrong and I am pretty sure that it is either A or B or A or C. Here I felt in the para summaries, I was not able to remove even one option. So probably I performed poorly, or maybe the para summaries themselves were pretty on the difficult side. This is as far as the para summaries were concerned. Para jumbles, I think there was one question which is definitely doable. Even the second one also, I got very close to getting it correct. So I would actually say that the para jumbles were easy on the easy to medium side. Basically in para jumbles, you are given 4 sentences and you have to find out the right way in which you can actually arrange them in a coherent passage. Now out of these 4 sentences, many times you figure out that, okay, 1 and 2 come together and 3 and 4 come together. You just don't know whether it is 1, 2, 3, 4 or 3, 4, 1, 2. Now, in one question, in one parajumble, I actually got it correct. In the second one also, I got most of the pairings correct except one. So, in general also, I felt identifying what is the start sentence, what is the ending sentence in both the parajumbles was on the easier side, which is again not the case in most of the parajumbles. So, I would actually say that these parajumbles were on the easy to medium side. Out of context, I got both the questions correct and I think I got them pretty easily also. So, I would actually say out of context, that is when you're given 5 sentences and you have to remove 1 sentence. I think both the questions are on the easier side. Para insertions for the first time I felt were slightly on the more difficult side. Not very difficult, but normally I find the para insertions to be very, very easy. Here I got one question wrong and I could even see that many people actually got it wrong. So I think one of the para insertions was on the more difficult side. But overall, I would say that if I have to talk about this entire section, I think RCs were definitely more difficult than usual and verbal was definitely more easy than usual. Overall, I didn't score very well, but I would say that if somebody is looking to score 99 percentile, getting a score of 36 marks roughly would mean 99 percentile. All the 4 RCs, even though they were doable, like I mentioned, every one of them comes with a catch. There was no RC which was completely solvable. There were RCs where the passage was easy or the questions were difficult, or there were some RCs like in the dark matter where the RC was difficult to read, but the questions were not very difficult to answer. This is basically about VARC. Let us now look at LRDI section. LRDI section, as expected, there were 4 LRDI sets. Each set had 5 questions. There was one set, I think, which should be definitely done. There was one set in arrangements. This is not a very difficult set. And normally, when you approach LRDI, I always tell people that if you are able to get one set correct, most likely you will clear the cutoff. And that set definitely is this arrangement set. If you spend, I think, around, say, we mentioned 14 to 16 minutes. I think most students who are aiming for, say, 90 percentile plus, if they spend around 15 to 20 minutes on this set, they will get it correct. It was not a very difficult set. You have to just reiterate through many clues multiple times and then you will get this correct. So this was a set that should definitely be answered. There was another set actually which was not a very difficult set. That was a set on bowling. This was in games and tournaments. Especially anybody who has already played bowling and knows how the scores actually work, I think would find this set to be fairly straightforward and very simple. But somebody who hasn't played bowling and if they are not sure of how the scoring actually works, they might take some time to actually get adjusted to it, or maybe they might have been afraid of this set and gone to the next one because it looks slightly complicated with a lot of rules being explained and all. But if somebody who has played bowling or somebody who has an idea of what is a strike, what is a score, those kind of things, what is a spare, I think would definitely get this set also correct. This was also not a very difficult set, but like I said earlier, some introduction to bowling would have been much more helpful. There was one set which was a time killer, a time sink, which was the scheduling set. This I thought was a fairly difficult set. It was a hard set and many people actually tried to get it correct because it also looks like a straightforward set. It looks like an arrangements plus a scheduling kind of a set, which many people tried to attempt, but very few actually could get it correct. This I think was a tough set. The next one was in roots and networks. It has a very beautiful diagram also in the question. But the problem with this, in my opinion, is that every question is kind of individual. So you have to keep solving these questions individually. And I personally don't like those kind of sets. But again, one or two questions can be definitely solved in this set also. So a perfect attempt, somebody who has gotten most of the things correct would get the arrangement set correct, would get the games and tournaments set correct. This is basically, I'm talking about somebody who is a 95 percentile kind of a person who had a fantastic section. They didn't waste any time. They were completely through and everything was going right for them. For that kind of a person, what I think they should have attempted is get the arrangement set correct, get the games and tournaments correct, and probably try to get one or two questions in the roots and networks set correct. Let me just again see how many were theta questions there. One theta question. I think there was only one theta question, but again, it was not a very difficult set question to guess what is the total number of roots or something like that would be there. And when you are asked this kind of question where the total number of roots have to be described, it would mostly be a single digit number. It won't happen that in this kind of a question, if you go through the passage and you figure out the number of roots, if you're not able to calculate it also, you can make an educated guess. You know that the number of roots would be a single digit number, probably a number which is say less than 5, maybe 5 or 6 or something like that, or maybe less than 5, but it won't be a number which is like say 100. So when you know that it is a theta question, where the number of answers is limited, an educated guess sometimes will also get you correct. That I think can be done for this kind of a question. Overall, I think the difficulty of this section was medium to hard. There was only one issue. Many of the students, I think, selected the wrong set. And even though I think some of the sets were doable, I think many of the people felt intimidated by the sets and they were not able to do a good job. Selection of the sets is very, very important. Like I mentioned earlier, if somebody spends say 20 minutes on the games and tournament set, they would most likely get it correct. Somebody who is scoring say 90 percentile plus, if they spend 20 minutes in understanding the rules of that bowling and if they push through with it, I think they would get it correct. It is not a very difficult set. It was a fairly simple, straightforward set. Similarly, even the arrangement set, I think was definitely doable. If somebody spends 15 to 20 minutes on it, most likely they would also get it correct. The performance of students in this DashCAT has been, in LRDI section has been definitely underperforming. It was underwhelming. Many people, and I was not able to understand why they performed like that. But I feel that many of the sets I think were intimidating. They were not feeling very comfortable with the set itself. I think because of that reason, they didn't score well. Overall, I say that there were two sets which were definitely doable. Both of them are arrangements and games and tournaments. Now coming to the quant section like always, I think arithmetic was definitely on the easier side. If I look at the questions, I think there were some questions in averages, ratio and proportion. I think they were fairly not very difficult, definitely on the scoring side. Basically, this is not a very easy section overall, but at least some of the questions should be answered. In that aspect, I think averages, ratio and proportion, there were 3 questions. I think they should have been answered, at least some of them. After that, I think time and work maybe slightly on the more difficult side within arithmetic, but again, not very, not impossible to do. I think they could be done. Let me just look at the time, speed, distance questions. In addition to it, I think there were some questions in profit and loss. Again, can be can be done. I think 2 questions are definitely doable in profit and loss. The next I would discuss is time and work. In time and work, I think the questions were slightly on the lengthier side. That I think might be an issue, but otherwise the question per se was not very difficult. I think one of the questions was on the difficult sides in time and distance, but the problem with time, distance and work was that the question length was slightly bigger. So I think many people were intimidated by it and didn't attempt it as much as they should have, which I think is fine. Even if you're not attempting time, speed and work, the other aspects of arithmetic at least you should answer. But there was one question in time and distance, which I think is fairly simple and most people got it correct also. This was about 3 persons who were running in a line, and I think some people started behind, some people started ahead. That question I think should have been answered. The next one was linear and quadratic equations. I think there was one question in quadratic equation which could be done. I think there was one in quadratic equation and one in linear equation. I think the linear equation one probably was slightly on the trickier side, but the quadratic equation one, if you know how to approach it, if you have solved a question which is similar to it earlier, I think it is a very simple, very straightforward question. But somebody who is looking at that question for the first time, that kind of questions for the first time, might definitely not answer it. They might feel that, okay, this is looking very complicated. This is about an expression which involves square roots, and there are 2 quadratic equations within square roots. But both of them are actually very related to each other, both the quadratic equations. So if you use that clue, I think you should be able to answer that question. But otherwise, I think people might have found it slightly on the difficult side. There was one question in inequalities which I think is a very difficult question, very hard question. It looks very easy, it looks very simple, but it is a pretty hard question, and I think many people wasted a lot of time on it. These are the kind of questions I actually want to put in our mocks also, because I want students to be acclimatized to these kind of questions where they are time sinks. If you shouldn't attempt those kind of questions, because it is also, if I'm not wrong, a theta question, and you are not sure, and it asks about how many integers satisfy that particular inequality. So even if you get it correct, because it's a theta question, you will never be sure about whether it is correct or not. Most people would try to enumerate it, and even then you would not be able to get it correct. So the risk reward analysis for that would be definitely not good. So those are the kind of questions, even if you start, you might think that it's an easy question, you start answering it, but after the first 1 minute or so, you should realize that, okay, this is not going to be easy. It is going to waste a lot of my time. Then after 1 minute, I would want you to stop answering that question and go to the next question. This is with respect to the inequality question. I think this has a fourth power of x, that question. The next one is functions and logarithms. In functions, I think there is one question in logarithms which is very straightforward, that should be attempted. Again, one of the things that I notice in a lot of students is in certain topics of quant, students don't attempt it at all. And one of the such topics is logarithms. I would want to stress that logarithms is an easy topic. It involves just basic applications of some formulas. And this question, for example, also is a fairly straightforward, fairly simple question. So that is a topic which I don't want people to be panicking about. And that is a question they should have attempted in logarithms. With respect to functions, I think functions, one question was on the easier side, especially the logarithms question, and I think even the functions question, both the questions should be attempted. They're not very difficult questions. They might take some time, but they should be attempted. Next, coming to the geometry questions, I think geometry was definitely on the difficult side. Even though we mentioned medium to hard, in my opinion, there is only, out of the 4 questions in geometry, only one question I think is kind of solvable. I think the remaining 3 questions in geometry are more difficult. Out of the remaining 3, I think one question involves a formula about given a perimeter, how many triangles can be formed. If you know the formula, I think you will answer that question. Otherwise, you will be struggling with geometry. So there are 4 questions in geometry. One I think can be solved. That one question, I'll tell you which question I think should be solved. I think it involves some coordinate geometry, maybe a centroid, that kind of a question. I think that question should be solved. The other question involves perimeter and scaling number of triangles. If you know the formula, you'll get it correct. But the remaining 2 I think are definitely on the difficult side. So I think geometry is definitely on the medium to hard level. The next one is number systems, probability and permutation combinations. Most people struggle in these topics. The number systems question I think was definitely a difficult question. It was not a question. Number systems question was definitely tricky. It is not an easy question. But one of the probability questions I think could be solved. There are I think 2 questions in probability and 1 question in number system. One of the probability questions I think can be solved. The number system question I think is tough. The second probability question also I think is tough. But overall, like I was saying, there are very few questions which are like sitters. Normally in CAT also you don't expect complete sitters, which is what we try to recreate in this DashCAT. But like always, I would stress that you should be very strong in arithmetic, because it is very difficult to set difficult questions in arithmetic. We try to set some difficult questions in time and distance, time, speed and work this time. But again, most of the other questions in arithmetic I think are definitely solvable. With respect to the other questions, again, there is no sitter. There is no sitter out of the 22 questions which I would say, okay, this is a question which most people would get it correct. This is exactly kind of what happened even in CAT 2023. But having said that, there were some questions, at least 4 to 5 questions, which were definitely in arithmetic, which were on the slightly easier side. And there were at least around 12 questions which were medium side. What I mean by medium is, if you spend some more time, you will get it correct. There are maybe around I think 5 or 6 questions which are definitely hard. One of the inequalities questions that I mentioned is definitely a hard question. There were some questions in geometry which were definitely hard. Those are the kind of questions which I don't expect a good student to answer within that 40-minute time. But having said that, I think this is a very interesting examination. There are many things that you will learn from it, especially from the quant section, because there are a lot of questions which are time sinks. So if you are able to identify those time sinks, I think it will be very, very useful for you. The 99 percentile mark I think is around 24 marks. That is, if you attempt 8 questions and get all of them correct, I think you can expect 99 percentile. Coming to the overall score to percentile, I think quant is around 24 to 25 marks. LRDI is 18. LRDI, like I mentioned earlier, I think there are at least 1 or 2 sets which are definitely solvable. But most people did not perform well in this LRDI. I don't know why, because I was involved in actually setting the paper. So I'm not so sure whether people felt intimidated by it or people were panicking from it. But the performance of students in LRDI and DashCAT 8 was definitely much lower than what I expected. I again analyzed, there were at least 2 sets which I think I would still stand by it. I would think there were 2 sets which were definitely doable. One was that bowling set and the other one was that arrangement set. I think both of them can be solved by a good student within 40 minutes. At least if not both, at least one of those 2 sets should be answered. In VARC, I think it is 36 is the approximate 99 percentile mark. Overall, this is definitely a tough DashCAT. There is no section which was a very high scoring section. So overall, this is a DashCAT which is definitely on the tougher side. 99 percentile I think is around 74, 95 is around 54 and 80 percentile would be around 40 marks.